Welcome back to Father and Son Investing. I know it's not quite September 2023 yet, but my son, who runs this channel and who actually just left for college this morning, tells me that I need to make this video today. So today I'm going to give you the September 2023 Treasury bill update. This is what this video is going to look like today. First, we're going to talk about some comments made by Jerome Powell last week at the Economic Policy Symposium in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Following that, I'm going to give you some comments by two other members of that FOMC committee. They're both federal bank presidents. Then we're going to look at what the schedule, the upcoming calendar looks like for things that are going to affect your Treasury bills during the month of September. Lastly, I'm going to show you the graph that I always do in these Treasury bill update videos. And then I'm going to give you my take on what I think the Treasury bills will be doing during the month of September, particularly the upcoming 52-week Treasury bill auction. So let's go ahead and get started. So as I said at the beginning of this video, Jerome Powell made a speech last week, August 25th, in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where he talked about inflation, progress, and the path ahead. If you want to be able to read the whole speech, I'll leave a link for you, but we're not going to look at the whole speech. I'm just going to give you what I took out of it as the highlights. If you have never been to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, it is a beautiful place, and I would encourage you to spend some time on vacation there. Yellowstone's not too far away as well. You can also see the Grand Teton National Forest. That was as an aside. Now, Jerome Powell, of course, gave this speech. I'm just going to hit on the highlights. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I don't want the length of this video to go too long. So the first thing that he talked about is kind of where we've been so far. He gave some of the inflation data that you can see here. The big thing to realize is obviously inflation has come down. The headline inflation, that's including everything, including gas and food, that certainly has come down. When we look at the PCE inflation, the core inflation, that hasn't come down by quite as much, but of course it didn't start quite as high either. After that, he went on to talk about some of the factors that are going to drive further progress. He did that in three ways by talking about inflation in three kind of broad sectors: goods, housing, services, and all other services. He used motor vehicles as an example. If you've paid attention to some of the headlines about motor vehicles recently, you'll see that prices are coming down and incentives are going up, that they're trying to induce buyers for motor vehicles. Housing services, he showed in a graph. I love graphs. He showed in a graph how rents are on the decline now, following that kind of normal lag that we see. I've talked about that in other videos. And then talking about all other services, this has been a little bit more sticky. He talked about healthcare, food services, transportation, and accommodation, like when you go on vacation and you're looking at an Airbnb or a hotel. These have been a little bit more sticky because they tend to be a little less sensitive to some of those other factors that they use when they're increasing interest rates. These tend to be a little less interest rate sensitive. He went on then to do his outlook. He talked about that in two ways as well. First, he talked about economic growth and how tightening of lending standards has certainly slowed loan growth. That, of course, will tend to slow business. However, it really isn't doing that because we see that GDP is growing faster than expected and consumers' spending remains robust. I talked about that in the last video, how the July consumer spending had gone up compared to June. He also talked about the housing sector is starting to show some signs of picking back up, so we see a little bit of some mixed message going on in here. And then he said something that you're going to see quoted when it comes to this talk. He says additional evidence of persistently above trend growth could put further progress on inflation at risk and could warrant further tightening of monetary policy. Pay attention to that because we're seeing in here that he's leaving that door open to raising rates. He went on then to talk about the labor market, and what I took out of this is that it's slowing slowly. The labor market has still been pretty robust. We really haven't seen the unemployment numbers going up. We have seen a bit of decline in the new jobs going on, and we're actually going to be looking at that in the calendar here in just a minute. When that'll be one of the first things coming up that we'll look at. So I just called it slowing slowly. What was the take-home message? I've got a few quotes for you here. Number one, we see the current stance of policy as restrictive, putting downward pressure on economic activity, hiring, and inflation, but we cannot identify with certainty the neutral rate of interest, and thus there is always uncertainty about the precise level of monetary policy restraint. What is he saying there? I think he's saying we're getting close, but we don't actually know where the endpoint is, and that's really a true statement. He goes on to say, doing too little could cause above-target inflation to become entrenched and ultimately require monetary policy to wring more persistent inflation from the economy at a cost of high employment. Then he goes on to tell us doing too much could do unnecessary harm to the economy. Again, I think they're saying we're close, but we don't know exactly where the end point is. Nevertheless, at the very end, he says, we will keep at it until the job is done. What is it that they're keeping at? Getting down to 2% inflation. That is their directive. That is their goal. And he's saying they're going to keep at it until the job is done. A lot of people are saying, well, couldn't you be satisfied with just 3% if it meant keeping the unemployment rate at what it currently is? They're really saying, no, that's not the case. And in fact, the European Central Bank president, who was also at the meeting, she had something similar to say, where she said we would be changing the rules of the game essentially if we decided on 3% now. All right, we're going to turn now to some of the comments made by some of the FOMC members after the meeting. They kind of take turns putting out little statements or press releases or interviews. And so in this case, we've got Loretta Mester from the Cleveland Fed. She's the president there. And we've got Susan Collins from the Boston Fed. She is the president there. And their statements are kind of similar. One's a little more aggressive than the other. We'll look at Loretta Mester's. You'll see the headline here, Fed's Mester sees another interest rate hike and says cuts may have to wait. That's really what you would read if I were to show you this article. So just take that headline there as the summary. If we look at Ms. Collins' statement, we'll see something kind of similar. She says the central bank has earned the right to take its time with interest rate decisions. And if we look at the sub-headline here, we'll see that it says policy needs to stay restrictive for some time, but cuts are possible by the end of next year. She went on to say in there, do not expect rate cuts anytime soon. What's the take-home message I get out of here? I get out of here what I said in a video I did recently talking about treasury notes and bonds. Longer. Higher, longer. That's what we're looking at. Higher rates potentially, and for a longer period of time. I know a lot of people are anticipating, a cut in interest rates as early as January of 2024. I don't see that happening based on what I'm seeing coming out of comments by members of the FOMC. That's going to come into play when I talk about which Treasury bill I like and what I expect to see happening in Treasury bills during the month of September. All right, I want to just take a quick look at the calendar. These are some things that you should keep your eyes on when you're looking at what Treasury bill yields might be doing. The first thing is actually coming out tomorrow on August 29th. That will be the JOLTS report, or the job openings report. So we're going to get a peek at what the employment situation looks like. Then on the 30th, we're going to get a look at the GDP report. Remember, I said one of those comments by Fed Powell was that GDP was running higher really than expected. And he also goes on to say in there it's running higher than the trend line. If we continue to see GDP running high, that's going to be one of the factors that the Fed is going to take into account. And you may be thinking, why does he keep talking about all of these things? I want to know about Treasury bills. But to understand what your Treasury bill yield is going to look like, you need to know the factors that could go into it here. Ultimately, what your Treasury bill yield looks like is whatever the Fed is setting as the benchmark for really all loans, and your Treasury bill yield is going to be similar to that. So that's why we're talking about so much of this. The following day, you're going to get the PCE report. Now, a PCE is similar to the CPI. It's really not as well known, but it is the one that the Fed pays the most attention to, particularly the core part of PCE. So if that comes in running hot, we're going to think that there's at least a little bit more likelihood for another increase earlier than later in the interest rate. Next week, what are we going to see? Well, actually, there's not a whole lot happening, except it is my son's birthday of father and son, so wish him a happy birthday on September 8th. Following that, mid-September, we're going to get a couple of things that are really going to be important before that Fed meeting that comes up the following week, and that's going to be the Consumer Price Index, the CPI report, and the following day is the PPI Index. Now, if those things come in running really hot, man, I think the likelihood for an increase in September could go up. We'll talk about what the market is expecting for whether the Fed will increase that rate in September or later this year in just a minute. Finally, on September 19th and 20th, that is when the FOMC meeting takes place. Now, one thing you should know is that 10 days before this meeting starts, the Fed goes silent. You won't hear any comments from members of that Fed committee really about anything. They're not going to be making any speeches. They're not going to have any press releases. You won't hear anything from them. It's radio silence for 10 days before that meeting. All right, I mentioned just a minute ago the odds of what the market thinks will happen at the next meeting. You can actually get these from the CME group if you're ever curious about where these predictions are coming from. It's the CME group who makes these predictions, and they say it's a 78.5% chance that rates stay the same and a 21.5% chance that rates will actually go up. That's actually changed a little bit since this morning. This has come down and that has gone up a little bit. All right, let's take you now to the graph that I always show during these Treasury bill updates. I think graphs say a lot, and they really give you a good idea of what trends are looking like. They also are wonderful for making comparisons. So let's just take a peek at these. I'll bring them in one by one. You can see what's been happening since the 1st of June. This even includes the auction that occurred a little bit earlier today for the 26-week Treasury bill. The 13-week Treasury bill wasn't quite ready when I made this slide. Nevertheless, the last one we'll bring in is the 52-week Treasury bill. Now, one of the things that I want you to get out of this is you're going to see that many of these have pretty much flatlined during the month of August. Look at the 4-week Treasury bill. Really did not do much. The 8-week Treasury bill had a little bit of a tick up, but we see that really not much is happening. Except let's look at the 26-week Treasury bill. Look at this little nice incline going on since about the 10th of August. What's happening there? Now, one of the data points we don't have yet, and we won't actually have that until September 5th, is the 52-week Treasury bill. Here is then my prediction for what I think is going to be happening for Treasury bills during the month of September. Remember, I said earlier, higher, longer as a theme. Keep that in mind. Higher, longer. Higher rates for longer periods of time. So what do I think is going to happen? Number one, with this 52-week Treasury bill, which we'll find out what the rate on that is going to be on September 5th, I think it's going higher. I think it's going to go significantly higher. We notice the 26-week Treasury bill has ticked up quite a bit since the last 52-week Treasury bill auction. So I would expect to see something close to that 5.5% for the 52-week Treasury bill. Why? Because we're getting the message from the Fed members that rates are going to stay higher longer. And even Ms. Collins, that Boston Fed president, was saying the second half of 2024. In a speech earlier, Jerome Powell said, essentially, we're looking at mid-year 2024. So I think it could potentially be even longer before they really start cutting rates. And I think that 52-week Treasury bill is going to start to reflect that. Investors are going to expect a higher rate of return. Why? Because rates are going to stay higher longer. So I'm looking for that to go up to, like I said, about 5.5% potentially. It'd be wonderful if it went higher and these rates actually started behaving like a normal bond market should. We don't see all these inverted rates. Nevertheless, that's what I'm expecting. I think then the two Treasury bills that look really nice are the 26-week Treasury bill, and I'm hopeful for that 52-week Treasury bill to go up. Nevertheless, any of these Treasury bills are really fantastic. We haven't seen yields like this for quite a while, and I don't think you can go wrong with any of them. It's just really a matter of your preference. If you need your money earlier, obviously you're going to want to pick a shorter maturity Treasury bill. So that's my take on Treasury bills for the month of September. If any of this was useful for you, please give us a thumbs up. We really need that for our channel. Please subscribe if you're interested in learning more of this kind of content and making sure that you don't miss it. And as always, please share this information with a young person in your life. If you've got a child or a grandchild, getting this kind of rate of return is fantastic. Get them out of those low-yielding savings accounts and look at Treasury bills as a potential alternative. Until next time, enjoy your investing.